I think that is still the best way to buy your first property because it allows you to buy your primary residence, make it an asset instead of a liability, and you are able to get all the tax benefits of owning a rental. This is a very active investment, and typically for folks on a work visa like H-1B, this is not recommended. I will repeat because this is a mistake that folks early on make. You consider your fixed expenses and then the remaining you think is your profit, and that is considered as cash flow. That is not true. For a short term rental, if you're trying to be top 1%, you have to think about adding a pickleball court or a mini golf in the backyard and making it an amenity.
Buying real estate in the US sounds exciting till you open Zillow, look at the house prices, realize you have to save some hundreds of thousands of dollars, immediately close the app and go back to your reality. That's what has happened with me. And then I also hear terms like leverage, capex, appreciation, and it feels like I have to learn a whole new language. So if you are in the same boat as me, then today's episode is for you. Welcome to Green Mango Finance, a personal finance podcast for immigrants by immigrants. We are your co hosts, Shreya and Kunal, and today I am taking on the role of the host, asking Kunal some probably difficult questions about buying your first real estate property. So, Kunal, how do you feel about today's episode?
This is my second attempt to convince Freya about real estate investing. So let's see how it goes. But yeah, bring on those tough questions.
Sure. I think starting off on the front foot, my first question is what is the first best step to get exposure to real estate?
I think house hacking is the best way still. I personally did not start with a house hack, and that is like one of my very few regrets that I should have started with house hacks so I could start sooner. I break down some of that in our first episode, buy versus rent, where I was team buy and Shreya was team rent. So check out the episode if you want to know who won that episode. But that's where I break down house hacking. And I think that is still the best way to buy your first property because it allows you to buy your primary residence, make it an asset instead of a liability, and you are able to get all the tax benefits of owning a rental without doing all the work that you would need in order to manage a rental.
Your way of approaching house hacking was doing some work to increase the value of the property and also renting out segment of your house and converting that into a long term rental. I remember you also discussed that there are certain tax benefits to that where you can deduct that portion of your house that you have rented out in your taxes. But I believe there are some other tax benefits to when you sell that property, right?
Yeah, so if you have lived in the home for at least 2 of the last 5 years, then you can avoid paying some of the capital gain taxes. So if you are single, then you get up to 250,000 in tax break. So let's say you bought a home for 500,000 and you sold it for 700,000. You made 200,000 profit. You don't have to pay any capital gains tax on it as long as you occupied the home for 2 years in the last 5 years. And the remaining 3 years, it could have been a rental, which is fine. So you get the tax benefits of owning a rental, but then also on the sell side, you can save on taxes. If you are married and filing jointly, then you can get up to 500,000. So your $500,000 home, if you were lucky and you sold it for 1 million, you don't have to pay any taxes on it.
So we have covered house hacking in some details. And but what if I already own a primary residence and I am looking to buy some rental properties? What are my options there?
Yeah, so let me first preface by saying that if you already own a primary, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy an investment property. You can now convert your original primary into a rental and buy a new primary as long as you are okay with moving into a new home. So that's how the house hacking strategy can now snowball. You can become a serial house hacker, buy a second property that you can house hack, while the first one is now your rental. You don't have to refinance or get in the high mortgage as a rental because when you bought it, it was a primary. The requirement for mortgage companies is typically that you live in that home for at least 1 year. And if you are optimizing for tax benefits, then you probably lived in that home for 2 years. So mortgage companies are okay with you now moving into another primary and treating this as your rental. So that would be my suggestion. But let's say you are moving faster because you have the capital and you've only lived in this current primary for 6 months instead of the 2 years that I'm recommending. In that case, your only option is going to be an investment property.
So, for investment properties, from what I'm hearing correctly, your interest rates are higher. And does that mean that the down payment that you need to put in, which is typically 5% at least for primary residence, does that also need to be higher?
Yes, for single family homes, it is typically 20% down. For multifamily, which is 2 units or more, it is 25% down. And your interest rate will also typically be at least 1% higher than the current primary residence mortgage interest.
I see. That does sound more intimidating given the current interest rate environment. And that naturally leads me to a question of cash flow. So, before we get into cash flow, I think it's good to elaborate what are the different kind of options we have when it comes to rental properties.
Let's think of it as what takes the most amount of management work versus the least amount of management work. So on the least side, the traditional investment property is a long-term rental where you find a tenant and they live in a home for 12 to 24 months. They sign a lease with you and then either they renew or you keep finding new tenants every year or 2 years. That takes the least amount of management effort. So let's put that on the left end of the spectrum. On the right end of the spectrum is flipping. So you buy a home, you renovate it in 90 days to 120 days, or depending on the project, it can take up to a year. And then once the renovation is complete, you flip it. You sell it for higher than you bought it and your expenses for renovation. This is a very active investment. And typically for folks on a work visa like H-1B, this is not recommended. So we'll not go that far right on the spectrum, but slightly left to it is a short-term rental. Call it your Airbnbs or VRBO. Those vacation rentals are more management work, but then with more work comes more cash flow. So the spectrum, even though is on the management effort, it also goes hand in hand with your original question about cash flow. And right in between that spectrum is midterm rental. So midterm rental is a furnished rental, which you are renting out on a monthly basis typically. Sometimes weekly, but generally it is considered a 30 plus day rental. So it is not as long as a 12-month rental on the long-term rental side. It is also not as short as like 3 days on the Airbnb side. So this gives you in between of cash flow and work. You're probably turning your units maybe once in 3 months versus once in 3 days, but also not as long as once in 12 months.
Cool. So I have some follow up questions. First, I want some clarification on how you are calculating cash flow in these scenarios. And my second question is related to, are there different tax benefits to these three different kind of rentals?
Because this is going to be the first rental property. Let's say you're going very simple, you're buying a single family home as a long term rental. So, first, you are going to consider your mortgage payment. So, if your home is 100,000, I don't know where you can find a home that cheap, but for easy math, we are considering 100,000 as your purchase price. Now, it's a single family investment property, so you will typically have to put down 20%, which is 20,000. So you definitely need 20,000 and another 5,000 in closing costs, which typically includes your inspection fees, title fees, insurance, all of that. So combined, you will need 20,000 for down payment plus around 5,000 in closing costs. So that will be your upfront cost. You definitely want to make sure you have that plus some reserves so you're not over leveraging. And then the remaining 80,000 is probably going to be mortgage from a big or small or local bank. You want to consider your interest for that mortgage. You want to also look at the property taxes and you want to get quotes for insurance. And this insurance will be a landlord insurance. It will typically be a bit higher than your homeowner's insurance because you are renting out your home. So there is a higher risk or higher liability for the insurance companies. So they typically charge a bit more. So this will cover your monthly fixed expenses. So let's do the math. Interest is 7%, let's say, on 80,000 mortgage. Your insurance is, let's say, $1,000 a year, and your taxes are another $1,000 a year. These are property taxes. Regardless your property being rented or not, you will incur these. So you have to account. So your PITI is going to be 700 a month, which is considered as a fixed cost each month, regardless of your property being rented or not. This cost you will incur and you will have to account for this in your calculations. Now, let's say you are able to rent this home for $1,000 a month. On paper, this is a good property to consider because there is something called the 1% rule. 1% rule is your monthly rent is 1% of your purchase price. So in this case, the purchase price is 100,000. So if you are making about $1,000 in rent gross, then it's a property worth considering further. I'm not saying you should buy it just based on that rule, but that can be the first filter when you look at a property. If it is way off the 1% rule, then you can just move on without wasting too much time in diving deep into the calculations. In this case, it makes sense because we've met the 1% rule, so we proceed with the calculations further. After $700 in fixed expense each month, you are left with $300. That $300 is not your cash flow. I will repeat because this is a mistake that folks early on make. You consider your fixed expenses and then the remaining you think is your profit, and that is considered as cash flow. That is not true. This is just your net after paying the fixed expenses. You still have to account for vacancies, capex, maintenance, property management. So let's put some numbers to it. Vacancy, let's say 5%. Capex is larger expenses like roof or AC or your furnace goes out. You typically create reserves for these capex or capital expenditures. So I consider 5% to start with. Another 5% goes towards maintenance because as tenants live, things are going to break. So another 15% is gone from your $1,000 rent. So 150 is gone on top of the 700. If you are self-managing, great. Typically on a visa, you don't want to self-manage because then you are exposing yourself to being considered as a active income and you want to keep this passive. So you probably will hire a property manager and they typically charge 8% to 10%, at least the good ones. You will find property managers who are even in like 3 to 5% range. Typically, you get what you pay for with property managers. So consider 10% for easy math and also when you are doing the due diligence. So now you are left with $50. That is your actual cash flow.
Okay, that was a lot of math, but I believe the 7% interest rate is the biggest factor here in reducing your cash flow, right?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. If that 7% was maybe 3 or 4%, sure, then you would maybe have another $50 left for cash flow. But at the same time, you probably will not get this property for 100,000. It will be maybe 110 or 120. So End of the day, it all comes down to the math. And if the math works, it's a great property. If not, then move on, look for something else.
How realistic do you think it is to get a cash flowing property with this interest rate and in this housing market?
It is not unrealistic. It is definitely more work to find a property. It is not going to be easy because high interest sellers are still not discounting their properties enough. So the prices probably need to come down a little more. But yeah, until then, you have to get creative. For example, you can take a property with more number of bedrooms or enough space to add more bedrooms and make it a co-living property, which means that you are locking every bedroom, making it a private space, and then bathrooms are either shared between two or three members, and then the common areas are shared. And there are platforms that allow you to list a property like that. It's become a very common practice since the interest rates started going up. So yeah, you have to get creative. Co-living is one option. You can look into short-term rental or mid-term rental as well to increase your cash flow for the same property.
So, before we move on to midterm or short term rentals, I've always questioned this. What people do you need on your team on the ground? So, property managers is something we have already discussed. Who are the other contacts that you need?
I think investor friendly agent or a realtor is really important. There are realtors who are focused on primary home buyers. They will say that they know investing and they will help you with investment properties as well, because transaction wise, it is not very different. But the mindset is different from a primary home versus an investment property. So look for agents who understand that and who are able to do this math along with you. And they should have a reasonable understanding of the rental market, not just the real estate market as a buyer or a seller. So that is really important.
I see. So, do you have any recommendation for how to find such realtors?
Bigger Pockets is the answer to all real estate questions, in my opinion. They have a lot of resources. They have a forum. You can go ask your burning questions over there. You can connect with like minded individuals to work on a deal together. They have resources section where you can find lenders, agents, property managers. They have books, podcasts, newsletter. I don't even know all the mediums that they have, but if you are a reader, listener, whatever, they have a way to get the right information to you. So get on Bigger Pockets.
Gotcha. So moving on, getting into, say, the short term rental space. I know that a lot of Americans advertise getting short term rentals because of the tax benefits where you can deduct those expenses against your W-2 income. So, do you have any insight into whether that is applicable for people on temporary working visas like H-1B?
Not on H1B, but if your partner is on H4 and they have an EAD, they could potentially become a real estate professional either by getting their realtor license, or they can be the manager for this short term rental and self manage. And there are, of course, requirements in number of hours and so on. Talk to your CPA about it. But H4 EAD can allow you to tap into this short term rental loophole. On H1B, you cannot.
Okay, I think that is our goal. So, if you want to help us get our H4 EADs, please like and subscribe and share this podcast with your friends so that we can monetize it. But, okay, back to topic. Kunal, so we did an analysis of long term rentals. For midterm or short term, is the analysis similar or are there other things we need to consider?
There are a few other aspects. Conceptually, it is still the same, but you want to consider furnishing. For midterm rentals, you potentially don't need a fancy couch or mini golf course in your backyard. But for a short term rental, if you're trying to be top 1% or top 5% in the area, if it is a competitive area, then you have to think about adding a pickleball court or a mini golf in the backyard and making it an amenity. You can check out Funkit Interiors. They do an amazing job of designing your Airbnb. There are many other service providers like that. It is a big cost upfront, but if you do want to compete in that market and be the top 1%, which is desirable and rewarding for short-term rentals, then you should look into it and consider that as an additional cost. The property management for short-term rentals is a lot more expensive. So if you are on H1B, you will have to hire a property manager. Short-term rental managers typically charge 20% to as high as 25-30%. And this is of the gross and not the net. So it is a lot of money.
I see. I will address the elephant in the room, but who even lives in Airbnbs anymore? Like, I know that I typically don't live in Airbnbs because they expect me to take out the trash, clean everything, and I just don't want to deal with that. And the price of Airbnb has also gone up in recent years, so it's comparable to hotels. And after I discovered points and miles, I think I have naturally gravitated towards hotels. So, do you think it's still a good investment?
Yeah, I think so. It is still a good investment. There are use cases, of course, and I think at this point, Airbnbs have separated themselves out from hotels. There was a point where this was a question like, why would you live in a Airbnb when you can go across the street and live in a hotel for the same amount of money and not have to do all the chores? But there is a time and place for Airbnbs too. There are homes that cater to large groups, bachelorette parties. There are themed homes. You get a lot of privacy. Like if you have a backyard pickleball court and it's 10 of you sharing that home, you get a private pickleball court, and no hotel is going to give you that option. You may have a pickleball court, but you are probably sharing it with 100 or 1,000 other guests. So there is certainly an appeal to this. There are cities or places near national parks that don't allow hotels. So in that case as well, Airbnbs become desirable. For example, Smoky Mountain National Park, there are cities around it like Gothenburg that have a shortage of hotels. And it is one of the very desirable market for buying a short-term rental because there are more visitors than the hotels can cater to. And there isn't room to build hotels.
Okay, noted. But all of these investment styles that you talked about involve a lot of people. And if anybody is like me, they hate interacting with people. And that's ironic because I started a podcast where I'm literally yapping. But are there any other options to get exposure to real estate without getting involved in the nitty-gritties of it? So, I guess to reframe, what are some passive ways of getting exposure to real estate?
Yeah, I totally resonate with not interacting with people. As you can tell from my personality on this podcast too, I hate talking. I hate talking to people. We ended up starting a podcast, so we'll see how this goes. If you don't like interacting with people or managing properties or managing property managers, then there are still ways of investing in real estate passively. There are REITs, real estate investment trusts. You can compare it with stocks. You can invest, and the amount you invest, you get a share equivalent to that. I don't invest in REITs, or I have not looked into it myself, so I'm not very familiar what's good, what's not, and what to look out for. Another option is private money lending or PML. This is where you become the bank. This is pretty interesting, exciting to me personally. And I'm looking into it right now. But this is where you vet the deal, you vet the borrower, just like a bank would if you were the one borrowing money from the bank. And then once you like them and like the deal, you can lend them the money and you get paid each month or at the end of the term, depending on what your terms are. Typically, the return for this one is around 12% annually, which is not bad. If you're lending 100,000, you are getting $1,000 passive. Like you don't have to lift a finger except for vetting the borrower and the deal early on, but that's few hours of work for constant payments. And then the last option I can think of as a passive investment is syndications. This is where a group of people will raise funds to invest in a large deal. So think 250 unit apartment complexes. If you need more information about syndications, just drop a comment and we will either bring a syndicator or someone who has invested in syndications to help us all learn together.
Yeah, these are all very new things to me, but I would say that the private money lending is something that I might be potentially interested in. So I would love to do a longer episode and bring on a guest about that too. But meanwhile, it's just the two of us. So, what is the last piece of advice that you can leave our listeners with?
I think I spent a lot of time in the analysis paralysis phase where I was, even though I knew the concept, I was too scared to take that first leap. Eventually, you will learn on the job, right? At some point, there are diminishing returns in this case. So once you have the basics right, just take action and then rest you will figure out. And in real estate, money solves all problems. So worst case, you will lose some money. It's an expensive MBA or treat it as a college degree that didn't work out well in the first go, but second go, you will be a lot more experienced.
Okay, so we are going to end this episode on this note: no analysis paralysis, which is great advice for two overthinkers. But if you liked this episode, please share with your friends, leave a review. We really appreciate it. And we drop episodes every Wednesday, so subscribe to our channel. We are Green Mango Finance across all platforms, and we will see you next week.